They used to call me the Heart of Grace Fellowship Church. I led the choir for 30 years, taught children to sing, comforted the grieving, and never missed a Sunday. But that changed when my daughter-in-law arrived in heels too high for humility. She smiled like an angel, spoke like a saint, and whispered like a serpent. One day she told me, "People like me more than you." I smiled back and thought, let's see how long that lasts. It was a warm Sunday morning in Charleston. Sunlight spilling through the stained glass windows like honey. I walked into Grace Fellowship just as the choir was finishing their rehearsal. My heart always fluttered a little hearing those familiar hymns. Even after I stepped down as choir director last year. 30 years of leading voices. 3 decades of weddings, funerals, and Christmas plays. I thought I had seen every type of person the church could hold. Until Chloe came along. She was beautiful. I'll give her that. Bright eyes. Polished smile. Always perfectly dressed. Even for Bible study. My son Daniel had brought her home after meeting her at a charity gala. She'd charmed everyone from the start. Even Pastor Collins. When they married, the congregation whispered about what a modern Christian couple they were. I tried to be happy for him. But from the beginning, Chloe had a way of making every space hers. The first few months, she was polite enough, calling me Mama Bennett in front of others, bringing casseroles to church picnics, always with a camera in hand. Then she started small changes, suggesting the choir sing something more upbeat, rearranging the flower displays I'd set up for years, volunteering to help with announcements, and then rewriting them completely. At first, I told myself it was harmless. The young always think they're improving things. But I began noticing how people shifted toward her. How she'd pause to take photos with the choir, tagging the church online with captions like, "Bringing grace into the modern world." One morning, I walked in to find her standing on the platform, giving directions to the tenors. Her voice was sweet, but her tone sharp. No. That's too slow. Let's make it lively. People love energy." The choir nodded. Uncertain. I smiled and said, "Careful, dear. You can rush a song straight out of its soul." She laughed softly. "Mrs. Bennett, your methods are beautiful, but a little traditional." "Tradition's what keeps the roof from falling," I said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe it's time we renovated." By the next week, she'd convinced Pastor Collins to let her lead a young women's committee for the upcoming Christmas concert. It was supposed to help bring in younger audiences. She invited influencers, sponsors, and even a local news crew. When I asked if the focus was still charity, she patted my hand and said, "Of course. We're just updating the presentation." I began to see her less as a daughter-in-law and more as a politician with pearls. One Sunday, as we were setting up after service, she leaned toward me and said in that syrupy tone, "You know, people really connect with me. They say I bring energy this church hasn't had in years." I looked up from arranging the hymnals. "I'm glad they find joy here. Chloe, that's what matters." She tilted her head, smile bright but eyes glinting. "People like me more than you. You know." I paused, letting the words hang in the air like incense. Then I smiled. Let's see how long that lasts. That week, she hosted a luncheon for the church women. I wasn't invited. Ruth Coleman, my oldest friend, called me afterward to say, Chloe had announced plans to modernize the choir and maybe take over coordination of the Christmas charity drive. Ruth said half the room clapped. The other half looked down at their plates. When Daniel came by that night, I asked if he'd heard. He sighed. "Mom, Chloe's just enthusiastic. She wants to help. Maybe it's time you take a step back." "I've taken enough steps back to trip over my own patience," I said quietly. He kissed my cheek. distracted. Don't make this a big deal. Okay, she just wants to feel useful. But useful turned into controlling. And soon the church bulletin was full of her name. Event coordinator, Mrs. Chloe Bennett. Special thanks to Chloe for leading our outreach efforts. The kind of attention that feeds ego like sunlight feeds weeds. Then came the meeting that changed everything. The committee was discussing the Christmas fundraiser. I'd been running it for 20 years. Every dollar accounted for. Every donation carefully handled. Chloe breezed in late, holding her phone, and announced, "I'll take over the charity finances this year. It'll be easier with everything digital." The pastor nodded hesitantly. "If you're sure you can handle it." "Oh, absolutely," she said. "I already set up the donation links." I folded my hands, keeping my face calm. Inside, something old and fierce stirred. I'd seen that same confident tone before in people who mistook charm for character. After the meeting, Ruth caught up to me in the hallway. "You all right?" "Martha." "I'm fine," I said. She lowered her voice. "She's moving fast. Too fast." "I know," I said softly. "But speed isn't the same as direction." That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet. The kind of silence that hums with worry. I went to my piano, the one my husband and I used to sing beside. My fingers touched the keys. Hesitant. Then sure. Music always helped me think. As I played, I remembered something my mother used to say. Pride climbs tall ladders, but the fall is always its own. I looked at the church bulletin on the table. Chloe's smiling photo on the front page. I didn't know exactly when she'd fall, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't need to push. Some people build their own downfall, one brag at a time. By mid-November, Chloe had turned Grace Fellowship into her personal stage. Every week, there was a new photo on Facebook. Her name in bold letters. Her words quoted under every post. Faith in action. Modern worship. A fresh voice for Grace. People liked it. Commented with hearts and praise hands. And she soaked it in like sunlight. I watched quietly. From the pew. From the hallway. From the corner of every meeting where she stood a little too tall. She started wearing brighter dresses. Louder perfume. Laughing just a bit too hard when the pastor spoke. She had a way of making herself the center without ever asking permission. Ruth, my closest friend, began to notice too. One afternoon, she came over with a pie and a whisper. "Martha, I think your daughter-in-law's playing with church money." I set the pie on the table. "What do you mean?" Ruth opened her purse and slid out a folded paper. "I help with the donation records. Remember, the numbers don't add up. She's been using the church PayPal for personal purchases." I looked at the printout. Designer handbags. A salon in Savannah. A company called Chloe Bennett Productions. She said it was for promo material. Ruth said, "But honey, the only thing being promoted is her." I sat in silence for a moment, watching dust float in the afternoon light. "You sure of this?" "As sure as I've ever been. She's using the Christmas charity fund." That was the same fund I'd built from bake sales and auctions for years. Every dollar was meant for the local orphanage. My chest tightened. I thought of the children's faces. The letters they used to send after every donation. That evening, I went to choir rehearsal. Chloe was there, leading with her usual flair, waving her arms like a conductor on Broadway. "Come on. Everyone," big smiles. "Let's make it joyful." She spotted me and smiled too brightly. "Oh, Mrs. Bennett, you came to see my little project." I nodded. "It's good to see the choir so enthusiastic." She laughed. "Well, I do my best. We're even adding some contemporary songs this year. Something fresh." "Fresh is fine," I said softly. as long as it still smells like faith. She blinked, unsure how to answer. Then she turned back to the choir. From the top, everyone. After rehearsal, I walked past her bag, left open on a chair. Inside was a shiny brochure that read, "A Modern Woman of Faith," featuring Chloe Bennett. Her face smiled back at me from the cover, arms crossed like she owned the pulpit. The next morning, I printed out the donation statements Ruth had shown me. I didn't plan on confrontation. Not yet. I'd learned long ago that truth always arrives on time, no matter who tries to delay it. That Sunday, the church held its monthly women's committee meeting. Chloe arrived late, as usual, wearing a white dress and carrying a tablet. "Ladies," she announced, "I'm thrilled to say our fundraiser is on track to exceed last year's numbers." Applause followed. I smiled faintly. Numbers can look holy when you don't read the fine print. Pastor Collins, kind as ever, asked, "How much have we raised so far?" Chloe scrolled dramatically. $17,000, give or take. Ruth and I exchanged a glance. That was almost double what we actually had. "Wonderful," the pastor said. "And all this will go directly to the Children's Fund." "Of course," she said sweetly. "Every penny." I could hear Ruth's breath catch beside me. When the meeting ended, Chloe turned to me. "You'll come to the Christmas concert, won't you? I'm doing something special this year. It'll be unforgettable." I smiled. "I imagine it will." The following week, I went to the church alone at dusk. The air smelled like pine and candle wax. I walked past the empty pews and knelt at the altar. "Lord," I whispered, "if pride is her sin, let truth be her mirror." Ruth joined me later in the hall, carrying a small flash drive. "Everything's on here," she said. "Receipts, screenshots, the works. What do you want to do?" "Nothing," I said. "Not yet." She frowned. "You're just going to let her keep lying? She's building her own ladder," I said quietly. "I'm just waiting for her to step on the wrong rung." The next few days, Chloe's voice was everywhere. She recorded a video for the church's website, talking about renewing tradition with modern grace. Her eyes sparkled in the soft lighting, her words dripping with charm. "Faith isn't about age or history," she said. "It's about energy and leadership." Ruth called that night. "You heard her speech." "I did." "You're just going to sit there." I smiled to myself. "Oh no. I'll be standing when she falls." By December, the church was buzzing with excitement. The Christmas concert was the biggest event of the year. Chloe had taken full control, even assigning me a seat in the back row. I didn't argue. Sometimes you see more from the back than you ever can from the front. A few days before the concert, I walked past the church office and overheard Chloe on the phone. Her voice was sharp, impatient. "Yes. Charge it to the donation card. I'll reimburse it later." She paused, then laughed. "It's for a good cause, me." I stepped back quietly, my heart steady. I didn't record her. I didn't need to. That night, I called Ruth. "Make sure Pastor gets that flash drive before the concert starts." She hesitated. "You're sure you want to do it this way?" "Yes," I said. "If the truth is light, let it shine during the brightest service of the year." I slept well that night for the first time in weeks. The pieces were in place, every note tuned, every word ready to echo. The next morning, I looked out at the church from my porch, lights twinkling in the distance. Chloe had been right about one thing. It would be unforgettable, but not for the reasons she thought. The church was glowing that night. Every pew filled, the air thick with perfume, candles, and expectation. The Christmas concert was always the biggest event of the year, but this one felt different. Flashier. Louder. Chloe had turned it into a show. She floated down the aisle like she owned the place. White dress, shimmering under the lights. Her smile was wide enough to make the stained glass jealous. "Good evening, everyone," she said into the microphone, voice trembling with rehearsed humility. "Tonight, we celebrate grace, faith, and generosity. Every dollar raised goes to our children's fund." Applause filled the church. Even I clapped. The pastor smiled politely, though I noticed his expression carried something heavy underneath. Ruth sat beside me, her hand steady on her purse, where the truth waited quietly inside a flash drive. The concert began. The choir sang carols. The young girls performed their nativity skit. And Chloe narrated each act like she was auditioning for a television special. Cameras flashed. People whispered, "She's so confident." I watched her with calm detachment, the kind a person gets after years of knowing that God always works with perfect timing. Then came the announcement. Pastor Collins stepped forward and raised a hand. "Before our closing hymn," he said, "I'd like to share a few words." Chloe smiled sweetly and handed him the microphone. He cleared his throat. "We're blessed with generous hearts this year. Our donations exceeded expectations." The audience murmured approval. "However," he continued, "there's been a discrepancy in the records. Some funds were misused." The air changed. Chloe blinked, her smile faltering. "I'm sure that's a misunderstanding." "Pastor?" He nodded slowly. "I hope so. But the receipts show otherwise." He held up a sheet of paper. The logo of Chloe Bennett Productions visible under the stage lights. Church funds were used for personal expenses, travel, wardrobe, promotional materials. The crowd fell into a stunned silence. You could hear the sound of someone's program slipping to the floor. Chloe's voice wavered. "That can't be right. There must be." Ruth stood from her seat, voice firm. "We verified everything." "Chloe, I handle the books. The money didn't go where you said it did." A few people gasped. One of the choir members whispered, "She took the money." Chloe looked around. "Desperat. This is ridiculous. You people are jealous." The pastor's voice was gentle but final. "Chloe, pride is a dangerous thing. It makes good people forget who they're serving." I rose from my seat. My legs felt steady, strong. I walked down the aisle slowly, every step echoing. When I reached the front, I looked at her, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the quiet certainty that only truth can give. "People liked you," I said softly. "You brought light and energy. But grace isn't a spotlight, Chloe. It's what's left when the lights go out." She stared at me, speechless. The pastor bowed his head. "We'll be reviewing this privately. For now, let's end the evening with prayer." As the congregation bowed, Chloe slipped away through the side door. The next day, she didn't show up to church. Her Facebook page disappeared, and so did the glossy photos. Daniel came by that evening, his face tired. "Mom," he said quietly, "she's gone to stay with her sister. She resigned from the committee." I poured him coffee and said, "Maybe she'll find what she was really looking for." He looked ashamed. "I should have stopped her." "You couldn't," I said. "She had to see the truth for herself." A week later, the church bulletin listed the new Christmas charity totals every dollar accounted for. The Children's Fund had never done better. People thanked me for helping sort the mess. But I just smiled and said, "Grace works in mysterious ways." One Sunday in January, I returned to the choir stand for the first time in months. The new group of singers waited nervously, sheet music trembling in their hands. I raised my arm gently. "Let's start simple," I said. "Amazing Grace." The first few notes were shaky, but soon the harmony filled the air. rich and pure. I closed my eyes and sang with them, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. After rehearsal, a young woman came up to me. "Mrs. Bennett, I hope someday I can be like you." I smiled. "Just be honest, dear. That's more than enough." That night, I sat at my kitchen table, tea steaming beside me, the quiet hum of the house wrapping around like an old hymn. I thought about Chloe, wherever she was, and hoped she'd learned that truth has a way of finding its way home. Maybe she would come back someday, humbled but whole. Or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, the lesson had been delivered. Because you don't need to destroy people to teach them a lesson. Sometimes, all you need to do is step aside and let them trip over their own lies. If you've ever been pushed aside, told you're too old, or made to feel invisible, remember, this truth doesn't rush. It waits. And when it arrives, it never misses. So stay steady, stay kind, and stay wise. Because the calmest voice in the room always ends up being the one people remember.